back to Free Speech Nation with me, Andrew Doyle. An Ontario court has upheld a ruling ordering psychologist and author Dr. Jordan Peterson to undergo social media training due to controversial posts he has shared over the last few years. Peterson was forced to comply with the order after the court judges dismissed his legal complaint against the College of Psychologists of Ontario. Earlier this year, the academic body claimed that some of his social media posts could be viewed as professional misconduct and asked that he completed the course. So earlier today, Jordan Peterson reacted to the court's decision on his YouTube channel. Let's take a look.
Been awaiting a court decision in Canada with regards to the Ontario College of Psychologists' decision to require me to be re-educated in relationship to my social media use or to lose my license. The court ruled today in favor of the college. They claimed that I have the right to free speech in Canada, but subject to, apparently, whatever limitations the college wants to place on me, and by implication, every other professional in Canada, and by implication.
So with us to discuss the court decision and its wider impact is journalist and author Ella Whelan. Ella, this is a disturbing case, isn't it? I mean, it's not as though the tweets that he's posted are sort of fascist or racist or all that kind of stuff. The tweets that he has posted are, I suppose, gender critical in one sense. They are quite abrupt sometimes. They are offensive to some people, but that's it. They're personal opinions.
Yeah, it is telling that it's all to do with some of the stuff he said about Elliot Page, a lot of the stuff that he said around the question of trans ideology and his particular view, which, as it happens, a lot of people share, of being gender critical and having some serious questions about, medication relating to children and things that most of us I think are quite normal. And he's got them banged to rights. I mean, this ruling really does say that you have free speech, but with the emphasis on the but.
Well, they've even said it in the statement.
Yeah, and that it's quite actually in a weird way, and it's good that Jordan Peterson is going to be, he's threatened to be very public about this and reveal it all. It's good that these kind of cases come to light because a lot of this is often very sneaky, very underhanded, and nobody ever really wants to come out and say we're for censorship. We're the ones that think censoring should happen. It's always a sort of a more subtle approach, and to have it written there and to have cases like this reveal the extent of censorship. And some people have joked on Twitter, who is going to be this poor social media manager who's going to have to sit down with Jordan Peterson, who's going to broadcast it to millions of people and tell him how to use Twitter.
It's quite. I mean, the idea of re-education. I mean, it's so bizarre. But you're right. He is in a position to do this. He actually said in his YouTube statement about this that he hasn't been able to practice since 2017 anyway because of activists and the rest of it. So he is in a position. He can do this. He can take a stand and he can push back because there must be other people that this is affecting who would just lose their jobs if they tried to complain.
Well, I mean, Ontario in particular is a bit of a basket case. I mean, someone that who's been on the show before and who's very big in terms of talking about free speech, Joanna Williams, back in May this year, went to give a lecture on, funnily enough, on people with gender-critical views being silenced, or women talking about sex and gender being silenced at a public library in Ontario, which was cancelled, which is kind of proving her point.
Did they not realise they're proving her point? That's just a demonstration of the reason why the speech exists.
I don't think they care. I think it was just, there's a kind of trend, particularly Canada's very bad for it, there's a trend with a sort of a practised cowardice around these issues, which is that rather than take on the kind of views that maybe if you disagree with Jordan Peterson on his views around self-ID or medication around trans ideology or things like that, instead of taking them on, the emphasis and the desire is always to just hit the ban button, hit the silence button. And that's obviously very bad for public debate. But, as much as Jordan Peterson has the cash, the resources, the status to be able to stand up for himself, there are lots of people who don't have that. Obviously, we're not quite as bad as Canada yet, but in the UK, we still have some very serious issues. I mean, the interesting thing that came out with this particular case was the idea that social media training would be the solution. I think it tells you a lot about the approach to the question of free speech or the question of public debate, which is, it's all about sort of how you package things up. And if you learn to use the right kind of language on social media, then you'll be all right. And it's not really dealing with the ideological clash that's really going on.
I suppose some of Jordan Peterson's detractors would make the argument that, well, in all sorts of jobs, we can't just tweet however we like. You know, when I was a school teacher, there are certain things, there are certain lines that I wouldn't have been able to post on social media. It would never have occurred to me to do so. Is there an argument to be said for that?
Well, it's interesting because the argument goes that Jordan Peterson is acting like a sort of public psychologist, that actually, despite the fact that he hasn't got patients or, you know, is taking on clients or anything on an individual basis, that his positioning of himself as a sort of the dad of psychology.
Well, a public intellectual,
yes.
You know, who's going to be tweeting.
The argument goes that means that he is representing the profession and therefore is subject to the kind of
rules. Very tenuous, I think.
I do think it's very tenuous, and, you know, you only have to... All these things, there's always a balancing act going on here, which is that, OK, professionalism in any kind of particular field, particularly those related to medical or mental health, are serious things. I don't want to poo-poo that consideration. But on balance, the idea that you would say that individuals have no right to voice their political and, you know, public opinions on platforms like Twitter, which have become, you know, quite vital public spaces for discourse and debate, that you would have to be silenced, you know, or trained to say the right thing. Well, I think that's the worst evil here. That's the more dangerous thing, that sort of the promotion of self-censorship.
And isn't it really that what they're punishing him for is not having the opinions that they agree with? Yeah. I mean, one of the complaints has been that one of the tweets was a criticism of Justin Trudeau. Yeah. And that apparently, according to this body...
What a sin. What a sin. I mean, particularly in Canada. But you can't criticise Trudeau.
Let's talk about that. I mean, Canada has particular problems here. I mean, we saw this with the truckers' protest, where you had leading mainstream politicians effectively smearing these people as fascists and saying ridiculous things like they honk when they were honking the horns, that meant HH, and that was a code for Heil Hitler. Yeah. That was not coming from some idiot blogger. That was a mainstream politician in Canada. What's going on there?
Yeah, and, you know, as much as Trudeau and the people who support this kind of action in Canada like to see themselves as ultra-liberal, very open, rainbow flagged, all the rest of it, actually, his government is extremely authoritarian. If you look at what happened in relation to the truckers, not just the way they were treated, but also the fact that they had their private finances frozen and you know, basically sequestered because they were putting forward a political opinion that you know, some people didn't agree with. Yes. And so there's always this kind of cloak and dagger action, which is that the appearances of being very liberal, with a capital L, but in actual fact, the test of someone's true belief in freedom, in liberty, not liberalism, but liberty, is whether or not you have a sense of tolerance, whether or not you're able to defend other people's right to say things. I mean, one of the things that, you know, Jordan Peterson has said on Twitter that got him into trouble in relation to this was he talked about a plus-size model as not being beautiful and calling her fat and things like that. And, you know, I don't think that's a particularly great thing to do. I, you know, would probably be quite pissed off about that if I was that model. Or indeed, as a woman, it quite annoyed me. But the idea that you would approach these kind of things, approach these kind of debates, or approach people who have different views to you, or even views that you find appalling. Yes. By throwing your toys out of the pram and saying that they have to go on re-education courses, I think it says more about you and your ability to engage in adult debate than it does about them. Well, even that tweet, you see, because out of context, it could sound like just teenage mudslinging, that kind of thing, just calling people fat on the internet. Actually, he was making a broader point, wasn't he, about aesthetics and about the way in which the idea that with modern art and modern aesthetics, that anything goes, it's about subjective view. And there is an argument, there is a debate to be had about this. Yeah, there is a debate to be had about it. It's probably not one I'd want to waste my time on. But, you know, this is the thing. I think Twitter, it's interesting that this has all come about around his social media use, because Twitter has become an incredibly influential place, despite the fact that most people do treat it, a lot of the time, like a teenage mudslinging fact. That means that's politicians as well as public figures. I mean, one of the fascinating things is that one of the academics who was key in being a kind of critic of Jordan Peterson has, you know, as these things always happen, someone's dug up one of her not-so-old tweets calling someone a BITC agent and saying, you know, horrible stuff about somebody. Interesting. And, you know, this is somebody who claimed that Peterson was bringing the profession into disrepute by using harmful words. Yes. So, you know, everyone's always a hypocrite in these things.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
it's far safer to just stick to the free speech line
Yes.
and say, I'll defend your right to say whatever you like, as you know, as long as you also defend my right.
And even if it's strident, if he's saying that, you know, we shouldn't be saying that plus-size people are beautiful because that, in a sense, allows bad health, poor health, or suggests that this is something that people should aspire to. That's a reasonable point of view, and people can be free to get offended. But to silence him, to say he needs to be retrained, I mean, it all sounds very kind of Stalinist.
It does sound Stalinist, and part of the problem, I think, for someone like me, we've got I help run the Battle of Ideas Festival, which is taking place at the end of October. You can still get your tickets, and one of the key themes that we're looking at is how these kind of culture wars that are really framed around questions of free speech, whether they're about aesthetics and being fat or thin, or whether they're about gender ideology, racism, lots of the things we've been talking about on the show this evening, about how a lot of it really all boils down to a question of freedom of speech. And a lot of that discussion about free speech is happening on social media, whether or not, you think big tech companies should be in control of it, whether or not you think government should be in control of it, whether or not you think social media experts, as Jordan Peterson says, whoever they are, I mean, they're going to get some 20-year-old out of university, they're probably the most expert at social media.
Yeah, well, certainly at using it, but not sort of deciding the parameters of acceptable thought.
Exactly, and, it all really boils down to who do you trust to police your own speech? And the answer should always be yourself.
Yes.
And the answer should always be that you are accountable to yourself and to the public who you interact with, and that the solution to opposing views, to difficult views, to sometimes disgusting views, like the police officer you were just talking about, is not to pretend like they don't exist by silencing them, but to investigate them, maybe to poo-poo them if that's what's required, but to treat people and other views with the kind of seriousness that they deserve, because the outcome, I think, of any, and this is sort of something that we're going to look at the battle, is the outcome of progress, of any kind of move in society towards a progressive future, has to be based on a fundamental baseline of freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and taking liberty seriously.
Well, Ella, I do look forward to the Battle of Ideas every year. It's the last weekend of October, is that right?
Yes, 28th and 29th.
A weekend of debates, hundreds of speakers from around the world. It's really worth people coming along to that. And I'll be there as well.
Exciting.
So, Ella Whelan, thank you very much for joining me.